Morning guys, Dr. Ken Nordberg here again. It's been a while, about a month, a little over a month since I've recorded a YouTube hunting seminar. And I've been anxious to start again. I've had a new series of hunting seminars that I'm anxious to get started on. And you're going to like this series. You're going to learn things about buck hunting from this series that you never knew before. And they're so important to successful buck hunting. Well, any kind of deer hunting when it comes to that. You know, does and yearlings and such. A lot of hunters are perfectly happy to take a yearling buck or yearling doe each year and enjoy the venison, and that's fine, you know. They can sure be easier deer to hunt, but even does and yearling bucks can be difficult if you don't hunt where those deer are each day. And I'll be talking much more about that later on. But to start with, there are three kinds of antlered white-tailed bucks in our woods. Three kinds. Now, one of the differences is their sizes, but size alone and size of their antlers alone don't make them different. What makes them different, these three kinds of bucks, is where they are and what they're doing when does are in heat. Now, where I hunt, the first 2 weeks of breeding of whitetails, the first of the 2 weeks of the breeding, or periods when does are in heat, are in progress, where I hunt in November every year in northern Minnesota. And it's been that way now for the last 30 years, and we've been become experts at hunting antlered bucks during this particular period. We've got to be really good at it. But these three kinds of bucks that I'm talking about all do something different, and they're located in different areas during that period. And what they're doing and where they are determines how difficult it is to locate spots to hunt these particular bucks. So that's what makes them different, is what they're doing and where they are during that particular period. And they aren't where they are normally would be, like say in October, they're all in one area. Come November, and when breeding begins, and actually a little bit before breeding begins, all of a sudden these three kinds of bucks are in different places. And that's where they are makes them progressively more difficult to hunt. Now, one of the crazy things about this is, well, we all know, for example, yearling bucks are the easiest of bucks to hunt. But even they aren't easy unless you hunt where they are on any one particular day during the hunting season. If they aren't anywhere near where you are, you're not going to do well. But if they're near, you're going to do well. And that's true of all these bucks. But so some things happen just before that first 2-week period of breeding begins in November, and it goes on until breeding ends. And in Minnesota, where we hunt, in the northern, up near the Canadian border, that first 2-week phase of breeding occurs between November 3rd and November 17th. Which pretty well covers the firearm hunting season in Minnesota each year. So I guess that's why we got to be good at it, because this has always been going on. Now, this last hunting season, we discovered that, wow, our deer numbers are way down in our hunting area because of wolves. Now our wolves, they're finally off the endangered species list, or threatened species list, after 45 years of being protected. And during those 45 years, our wolves became more and more numerous. And it got to the point where they finally overwhelmed their main food supply, namely whitetail deer. And our deer numbers last year, the way it appeared each day, there was some changes there. I've changed my mind a little bit, but our deer numbers were down to about 3, maybe 4. In some areas, some square miles, we had as many as 4 deer per square mile. In an area where quite a few years ago there were 22 deer per square mile. That's quite a change in deer numbers in this area. But because deer numbers were that low in our area, our wolves have been suffering now for several years. They're not getting enough of their normal food, mainly venison, to eat. And they're suffering because of that. And I don't want to go into that now, but that's why our deer numbers are so low. Well, during the last 2 days of our last hunting season, I started to wonder about something. Some of those bucks we hunt, well, let's talk about that for a minute. Beginning about September 1st every year, all of our bucks shed velvet. Yearling bucks and non-breeding bucks, the bucks that don't get to breed, and then dominant breeding bucks, they're the bucks that do all of the breeding, at least during those first 2 breeding phases of the rut. The second one beginning about December 1st. Now, during September and the first half of October, those bucks commonly congregate in a special feeding area. All the bucks living in a square mile congregate within a special feeding area where they feed together. Because late in feeding cycles, after they've finally filled their stomach, whatever let's call it, their stomachs, they want to fight. They want to determine which of them is the toughest and meanest buck in a square mile, and where all the others stand in regard to in battling. And because of that, by late October, most of this fighting starts. The serious fighting begins in October, especially after it starts to begin cooling at night in mid-October. They battle. And this one buck beats all the other bucks living in the square mile. To make this a little more clear, let's draw a map here, a rough map. Now, we've talked about this before, but I want to do it again. And let's say this is a square mile home range of bucks living in the square mile. There's other deer too living in that square mile. But buck ranges tend to overlap. The big dominant buck, the one that beats up all the other bucks in the area, and he's becoming more and more dangerous as we get into the last half of October because his testosterone levels are welling in his bloodstream. And he's getting to be big, mean buck. And finally, about, a few days during the last week before breeding begins, he doesn't want any of those other antlered bucks in his breeding range, which is his home range. And he doesn't want any competition for breeding. He wants to get rid of all those other big bucks. And boy, he's a big, mean buck in that area. But meanwhile, back to ranges. Now, as I've mentioned before, there are usually a number of other mature bucks living in this range, in a typical dominant breeding buck's range, and they can number from anywhere from 3 up to 5 extra bucks that are 2.5 to 6.5 years of age. Now, dominant breeding bucks are usually the older bucks, 4.5 to 6.5 years of age. And these older bucks are in their prime at age 5.5. In the wilds, they start to go downhill physically, and antler-wise too, at 6.5. But they're in their prime at 5.5. Now, some of these bucks, let's just imagine here's maybe a 5.5 that isn't a dominant breeding buck living in that range, and let's say here's a 4.5, and these are big bucks. Some of these bucks are trophy class bucks, the ones that don't get to breed, the ones that are going to be chased out of this range before breeding begins, out of this dominant buck's range. And these ranges can overlap. This guy might get way over in here often, and this guy might get way over here often. There's some younger bucks, like 3.5-year-olds living in there, and they might have a little smaller ranges, and that might encompass an area like this and an area like this. So, here's some areas where 4 different bucks, plus the big dominant buck, might appear at any one time under certain circumstances. But they overlap, all kinds of them overlapping. And there could be one smaller range like that over here, and with a 2.5-year-old buck in it, and another one over here with a 2.5, and so forth. So we got overlapping ranges of older bucks, some of which might actually be trophy class bucks living in this square mile. Now, a big dominant buck, like I say, he owns this entire area here, and he doesn't care about these other bucks living there, at least until a week before breeding begins each year. Like I said, within this square mile, there's some does, and normally we'll have 4 to 5 home ranges of mature does living in this buck range. And they don't overlap. They're all separate, There's probably a doe range here and another one over here. And in this case, let's just have 4 of them and make it simple. Now, these ranges are not near as big as buck ranges normally. They average, I spent years figuring this out, doing a lot of trapping around the woods to determine it, but they're usually, they average about 125 acres. That might not seem like a lot of land, but I grew up on a farm, a 40-acre farm in northern Minnesota, and I thought 40 acres was really huge, especially the 10 acres I had to take care of, a 10-acre potato field that I had to take care of. Picking potato logs and hilling those potato plants in late summer before they start growing little small new potatoes. That 10 acres was huge. And by the time you got done picking potato bugs, you had to start all over again. It was a huge area. So 40 acres seemed awful big, but gee, when you take the average doe home range is like the size of 3 40-acre farms. That's a big area, huge area. And so that's like, these are like 3 40-acre farms in, or 4 40-acre farms within this square mile. Now, doe ranges are always separate from one another. They don't overlap. Although, if there's like say a clear cut in the middle of that, or a good feeding area in the middle of that, does will commonly share it. Now, let's imagine we got a clear cut that covers this whole area in between, a natural feature which separates doe ranges. Well, every doe in all these different home ranges will feed in there. That's important to know, that it isn't going to be just one doe feeding there. Now, this doe that lives here might have several other places it likes to feed, and they're smaller probably, but they can share them there. They'll share an area that's outside of their range, but not if it's inside their range. Does are vicious when it comes to other does with young invading their ranges. They'll chase those other does out, they'll kick. Boy, will they kick those deer, chase them. Boy, those other deer are running for their lives when they get in another home range or deer. Now, there's some times when there's an exception to this, but basically this is how it's all set up. Now, each one of those does is not living alone. Normally, well, they have fawns, in a moderate to mild winter, after mild winter, each one of those does where I hunt could have twin fawns. They commonly will have twin fawns. If the does are 3.5 years of age or older, they have twin fawns in the spring, and they're going to be born during the last half of May. So, but one or two, but the wolves of this area, they eat fawns all summer long, and it's not uncommon where I hunt that by November 1st, only 2 of those does, of those 4 does, will still have a living fawn, and the other 2 won't have any. And because the wolves will succeed in finding and eating 3 out of 4 of them all through the summer months. So, but where you hunt, if you don't have the wolf problem, those does, there's other reasons why fawns won't survive, but most of those does will have 1 or 2 fawns in November, and half of them are bucks. But doe families, you know, they can range in size from, well, upper wolf country where we hunt. A doe family might only be 2 deer. Might even be just a single deer. Wolves ate her babies and maybe and a yearling doe as well sometime during his first 2 years. And maybe the yearling buck is still alive, and so, but he might be away at the time when you see the doe. It can be small up there, but you know, in areas where they're well protected, like urban areas, suburban areas, farm areas, a doe family can be as large as 7 deer. I mean, you get a mild winter, and in the spring, that doe might have triplets, and no wolves to eat the babies. And boy, come fall, there's a whole bunch of antlerless deer, and maybe 1 or 2 yearling bucks in there. They're all progeny of that mother. And it's a holy cow, look at all those deer. So doe families can range in size quite a bit. That's great. And then also, you know, while breeding is going on, if this doe goes over here and this doe is nested and her fawn and yearling goes with her, now all of a sudden you got a double in numbers of fawns and yearlings with 2 mature does, or a doe, yearling doe that's in here. But yeah, so it can look like a harem. Look at all those antlerless deer with that big buck out there. So that can happen also. Now, buck fawns, you know, they don't have antlers. They'll have little knobs on their foreheads, but that's about it. Now, here's another thing to always remember. Yearlings remain within the ranges of their mothers all through their yearling year. It takes 2 years of training by their mothers before those young deer have a chance of surviving in the wilds on their own. A lot of training involved there. So mature does all during spring, summer, fall, early winter are not lone deer. They're deer with youngsters, with fawns and yearlings trailing them. Now yearling bucks are different than yearling does. They're a little bigger. Yearling bucks are about the same size as does, mature does. Yearling does are about 20 pounds smaller. So our does run 140, 150 pounds, no matter what age they are. There's some that get to be fatter, but some things never change once the doe gets to be a certain age, usually age 2.5 or 3, in that area. From that time on, their hoof lengths never change, and their dropping lengths never change. And as you know, us Nordbergs, we depend on deer signs to tell us where certain deer are on any one day during the hunting season. And we can identify deer by the lengths of their hoof prints and their droppings. Now, in a doe range, there's a lot of things to know about what I'm talking about here, but in a doe range, there are always a lot of deer trails. That female deer, that mother deer, with her herd of youngsters following her around, will make all kinds of trails all over the place within their range. There are trails going every which way. They have at least a dozen ways to go anywhere on any one day, depending on the wind direction, when to go into the wind to go to a feeding area so they can smell if there's any danger, any wolves or humans hanging around that feeding area before they get there and go somewhere else as a result. But they have all kinds of ways to go around. In between those doe ranges, there's hardly any trails. There's a few here and there that connect them. Those connecting trails are used by bucks, especially older bucks, 2.5 to 6.5 years of age. And they don't make many trails. They kind of depend on doe trails to get around. But there's lots of doe trails within doe ranges. So keep that in mind. When you're out in the woods and boy, you're finding deer trails all over the place, you're in a doe range. When you're in an area where there aren't many, you're between doe ranges. And most of the trails that you find between those doe ranges, unless they cross like this feeding area, will not have many tracks of does in them. It'll be almost, in some cases, the only tracks made by big bucks. Now, remember little deer have little tracks, and medium-sized deer have medium-sized, and big deer have big tracks. And same with their dropping. Well, same with their beds, but we're not going to talk about beds in this series that I'm talking. Not too much anyway. So anyway, something to remember here. Now in that range, let's say there's a doe with 2 fawns and 2 yearlings. Let's say, gee, the yearlings all survived last year, now they're yearling age and they're living with their mothers. Now yearling bucks are different than yearling does. The yearling does will pretty much stick with their mother all during this second year. They'll be close by, they'll feed together, and they'll bed together. Now bucks, they're starting to want to explore. They'll explore besides their own range, they'll start exploring off range. They can get way over the edges of the square mile and even off range, exploring what's out there. It's kind of a thing with bucks. And it's important, and it would be important in the future for them to understand how important their exploring is going to be. But they do that. Now, another thing happens now. Let's say, we've gone through the month of September, and and early October, and let's say all of the bucks, even the yearling bucks, we'll get together maybe over in this part of this feeding area. They'll gather together every morning and every evening to feed together, and then fight. And battling between bucks is a orchestrated thing that doesn't normally kill the bucks. But when you start getting into late October and these big dominant bucks are with all this testosterone and what can be quite dangerous, and they commonly will injure other deer during battle because they have larger antlers and big strong necks. The big dominant breeding bucks generally have big and much enlarged necks. They have lots of muscle in their necks and in their shoulders. And the way they battle is they engage their antlers and push. And the idea, the buck that forces another buck to give ground, to be pushed backwards, and then finally maybe even has to jump away because that big buck with that powerful neck and the shoulder, he's got his head turned, and antler tines, which are longer than a lesser buck, like say a 3.5 or 2.5, longer tines and more of them, are pressing against the other buck's neck and maybe its head as well, the jaw, and that hurts. That big powerful buck is pushing him back and making that buck want to get away from him as quickly as possible. He'll jump away, run away. When that happens, that bigger buck has won the battle. And when you get to that point where these big bucks make quick work of winning those battles with those other bucks, and all the other bucks by this time, at the end of October, they are afraid, they're scared to death of those big dominant bucks, because boy, they'll come in there, and if they want a battle, boy, click, 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 and pretty soon the other one's running away. It doesn't have a chance. And they know this is, they all realize that, oh, this is the big dominant breeding buck. Well, they don't, maybe they're not thinking in terms of breeding, but it turns out that way. So now we're in the last week now before breeding begins, the end of October and the first few days of November. And during that period, the big dominant buck that owns that square mile, he's decided he doesn't want any competition for breeding that's coming up. Especially that first 2 weeks when 85% of does breed. Now, yearling does breed, so all the yearling does living in this are deer that big dominant breeding buck is going to breed during this period. And so there's, quite a few does living in that buck square mile. And those are the does he's going to breed. He doesn't want any of those other antlered bucks. He's not going to pay much attention to a fawn buck. They won't chase them away, but yearling bucks, boy, yearling buck's got antlers, and yearling bucks are capable of breeding, and they're thinking about breeding. They're taking part in this whole program that's going on right at this time. Mid-October, every one of these bucks wants to have a breeding range. It gets cool at night, all of a sudden they're all out there. There's a frenzy of making antler rubs and grouse scrapes. Now, contrary to anything you might believe about antler rubs and grouse scrapes, those markers are made to tell other bucks, this is my breeding range. A lot of animals only use urine to mark their ranges. That's my range. But whitetail bucks go beyond that. They create signposts that are easy to see and smell that tell other bucks, this is my breeding range. And that's what antler rubs and ground scrapes are. Antler rubs have lots of scalp muscat. they scrape the outer bark off, so you see the bright underwood, on a tree, and you can see that way over there. I mean, this is a good signpost. This way over there, there's an antler rub. And if you were to go up it, next to it, soon afterwards, you would, and sniff it, you will smell a musk on that tree. And that musk comes from the buck's scalp. There's glands on the scalp between the antlers. And on a big dominant buck, it seems like they really produce a lot of this particular musk. It's contained in a syrup-like liquid that flows down the side of their faces down to their necks, and it dries on the necks, and every time the buck turns his head, it creates wrinkles in the sides of the neck. That's one of the signs of a big dominant breeding buck. Well, anyway, that particular musk is rubbed on antler rubs and branches overhanging ground scrapes. They'll mangle branches up there that get close to breeding. They'll mangle branches overhanging a ground scrape, and that musk is applied to those as well. Now, the largest source of musk on a buck's body are the tarsal glands between the hind legs. And they have a little knob of fur overlying them, between there. And at this point, those particular glands are producing all kinds of musk. And most bucks, I mean, next time you have a buck hanging in camp, check out those tarsal glands. You see that tuft of fur there? And sniff that. And boy, that's powerful musk coming out. And a big dominant buck, you don't even have to lean close. You can smell that. Now, what the buck does to get that musk on the ground, scrape on the ground, he'll stand on top of the ground scrap, he's bared the ground, making it visible, easily seen, of leaves and turf and moss, and so you have bare dirt there. And then he'll put all four of his hoofs on that thing and press his hind legs together to squeeze musk out of those tarsal glands. And then he'll start urinating, and the urine will run down his legs through those tarsal tufts of fur that are now full of musk, and they'll be carried to the ground by urine. That's how that musk gets there. And once these bucks start creating all these antler rubs and ground scrape, they're going to start renewing them often. Every 24 to 48 hours, they'll renew. Even a lot of those antler rubs will be renewed during this particular period. It's a short period, but lo and behold, and most older bucks understand this. A buck that has survived 3, 4, 5, 6 hunting seasons know this is coming. They know that big dominant buck isn't going to stand to have them around pretty soon. And sure enough, here it comes, and this buck sees that other buck, and he's going to charge. Oh, here I come, boy! I'm going to beat the daylights out. And all those other bucks, they've been through this already. They'll turn and run off range. They'll run. The buck probably won't chase them very far off range, but he'll chase them out of there. He's making it known that I don't want you around here for a while. And those older bucks that have been through this before, they understand it is not going to be safe in that big buck's range until breeding ends. And up where we hunt, that's going to be that first breeding phase. That'll be November 17th. It ends. All of a sudden, there's no more pheromone produced by does and heat in the air. And these bucks quickly recognize, these experienced bucks, older bucks, some as old as the big dominant breeding buck, and as big maybe, but not as aggressive, but still big bucks. There's no more pheromone. It's safe to go home, and they'll return home. Now, what this means is that during this period, this particular period, when you count the week before breeding begins and then the 2 weeks being, there's a 3-week period here when all antlered bucks, including yearling bucks, have been chased off range. So that's one way bucks become different. There comes a point when the big dominant buck is almost the only buck on that range for a period of up to 3 weeks. No other big bucks living on there. Now, yearling bucks can't stand that. They still are dependent on their mothers for direction and leadership when faced by danger. They get chased off range. Holy cow, this is dangerous. They're being chased. They know now they don't want to be caught by that big dominant buck in this period. Because boy, he's sure been rough lately. So they'll run off range. But generally, they'll quickly return home. And they got to get to mother because they don't know what to do. And they're in the off range there, and boy, I don't know anything about this place. I want to be with mother, who's going to show me what to do the next time that big buck comes. But the poor yearling buck finds out that she's not particularly interested in leading that buck to safety, that yearling buck, when she's in heat. In fact, he's thinking, oh, there's a female in here, and you know, it's genetic in his nature to want to breed. There's a doe in heat, and it's his own mother. But generally, those mother deer won't allow their own yearling buck to breed them. You know, kick them, chase them away, get away from me. Go lay down. Good way to avoid being bothered by a buck that's aroused by doe and estrus pheromone here. Is go lay down. You can't breed then. That is safe from that. So anyway, but that mother is not interested in teaching that young buck about what to do about the big dominant breeding buck. And meanwhile, the big dominant breeding buck from this time on is regularly patrolling his range and renewing his ground scrapes and some of the antler rubs during this period. Now, more than 90% of antler rubs and ground scrapes are made during this period, you know, from mid-October until breeding begins. Before breeding begins, doesn't mean breeding has started yet. It just means they are establishing breeding ranges. And now the big guy, he's chased all the other ones out of there, and then all of a sudden there's all kinds of ground scrapes in this square mile that are not being renewed anymore. Look at here, there's leaves on here, snow on this ground scrape or whatever. A buck won't allow that as long as it's there. All those other older bucks have been chased away, so they're not renewing ground scrapes anymore. That's why there's always ground scrapes during this period that are not being renewed. From that point on, the only ground scrapes being renewed in this area are those made by the big dominant breeding buck. That's the only sign. Now, this is what makes these bucks different for a while breeding is a problem. During this period, all the other bucks have been chased out, but these yearling bucks keep returning. And during their returns away from their mothers, they can do foolish things. Moreover, they got a burning curiosity. They find something they don't understand, which might be a hunter. You know, what is that over there? And for this reason, yearling bucks are the most vulnerable of whitetails during fall hunting season. They really are. So that makes them different. Now, who's the next most vulnerable deer in the woods? You're not going to believe this, but it's the big dominant breeding bucks that are most vulnerable during this period, this 3-week period. And why is that? Because they are going to be wherever there are does and estrus during this period. Now, if you're a hunter that understands habits and behavior of older bucks while breeding is in progress, you know that wherever there's a doe and estrus in that period, that's where the buck is going to be. He's going to be with her for a period of 24 to 26 hours, because that's as long as, you know, each doe is only going to be in estrus for 24 to 26 hours during this 2-week period. And they don't all go into estrus at the same time or go into heat at the same time. They kind of stagger. There might be one doe in heat in this square mile one day during this 2-week period. Next day there might be 2 of them. Now maybe the mature doe and the yearling doe over here during the next day. Next day, none. I mean, it's not like a carnival of deer running every which way and bucks breeding does like a lot of hunters imagine once breeding begins. And so this buck only has these does to breed. And when there's none in, he'll still be moving along. He's going to, and when he does find a doe, he's going to only be with her for a day, 24 hours, or maybe a couple hours longer than that. And then off he's going to go looking for another doe in heat, which is easy for him, the deer. You know, my dog can smell a female dog in heat a mile away. Nothing to it. And I finally had to have him neutered because of that. Big bucks can smell does in heat a mile away as well. So it's only a mile. Well, it might be longer than a mile one way and shorter the other way. But if he's here and this doe is in heat and the wind blowing in that direction, that buck is going to smell that doe in heat way over there. And that's where he's going to go. But you see, what's going on now is this buck is moving around all the time. Every 24 hours he's somewhere else. And if there's no does in heat, it might be 48 hours before he's finally somewhere else. So anyway, there's a lot of movement going on by that big dominant buck. Now, there's a difference between different bucks, older bucks. Now, there are lots of older bucks. I've known them for years, and there's still bucks like that. That big dominant bucks, they counter hunting by becoming nocturnal. I mean, this, you know, big bucks with big antlers are big with big antlers because they've been successful at avoiding you during previous hunting seasons. So a big dominant breeding buck in his prime, he's 5.5 years now, he's been avoiding you. And he knows how to do it. He's really good at it. He's really good at identifying hunters safe distances away and very good at keeping them out of sight of them all through hunting seasons. And so are a lot of these other bucks that have been chased off range. But one thing really hurts those big dominant bucks. They are going to be, where they end up each day is going to be near does and heat. Now, if you're a hunter who understands all this about habits and behavior of older bucks, especially the big dominant breeding bucks, you understand this. And if you make it a point every day, every half day, we do it every half, to be very near, very fresh tracks made by a big buck that is with a doe in heat. And if you understand deer tracks, oh yeah, this big buck, a big buck here with 4-inch tracks or maybe 3 and 3/4 inch long hoof prints is with a doe, and that doe, all these mature does have hoof prints that are 3 inches. Sometimes 3 1/8, but 3 inches. And you see, here's big 4-inch tracks with a doe with 3-inch tracks. Man, that's where you want to be hunting right now, if those tracks are really fresh, if the edges are real sharp and clear, and compared to these tracks over here, gee, they must have been made days earlier because they aren't clear like those tracks that were just made. You want to be where that doe is, not where it's feeding this morning or this afternoon. That's where you want to be. Now, or midday, close to where that doe bed, because wherever she beds or feeds, that's where that big buck is going to be. So you got to understand habits and behavior of older bucks, and you have to understand, recognize information provided by deer signs. Another deer sign that you might find out there, a big buck dragging his hoofs from track to track in the snow. That's a buck that's smelling pheromone. It might be from a doe that he's with. It's a swan. That's a buck that's under the influence of pheromone being emitted by a doe in heat. He's dragging his hoofs from track to track. Now, he might be alone, but the direction he's going, upwind, is a doe in heat, and that's where he's going. And so later today, he's going to be with that doe in the feeding area that's over there. That's where you want to be this evening. So you see? Or, let's say it's evening, you're going back to camp, and you run across these tracks. My boys call them railroad tracks. You see these tracks in the snow. He's going to be with a doe in the direction that he was going in the morning. That feeding area, right over there. And there's feeding areas all over this country, but that's the one where you want to be in the morning. You know, that's how you become regularly successful at taking older bucks, understanding deer signs and their habits and behavior while breeding is going on. So, believe it or not, the second most easy bucks to hunt while breeding is going on is big dominant breeding bucks. Now you might not believe that because you hardly ever see those bucks, much less take one, no matter how hard you try to hunt. There's all kinds of reasons why you fail, and I'll get into that later. There's a whole bunch of reasons for that. It's not the buck that's making it hard, it's yourself, the things you're doing. Take doe and estrus lure scent. You know, you can use doe and estrus lure scent with success yet today, though 15 million hunters have been doing it since the middle of the 1980s. You know, during that period, since the mid-1980s, surviving bucks have learned how to tell the difference between doe and estrus lure scent being used by a hunter and doe and estrus lure scent actually being released into the air by a real live doe. And you aren't going to like this. Nobody's going to like this, you guys. But when a buck, big buck is downwind and he smells that pheromone, he can tell whether it's you that are providing that pheromone or a real live doe. And the reason is, real live does have all kinds of odors on them. Next time somebody in your gang gets one or you get one, you have it hanging up, go over there and sniff that deer. Sniff its forehead, sniff its body, sniff its hoofs. Oh, there's all kinds of deer odors, you know, coming off that deer. Now, if that buck downwind smells that pheromone, but he doesn't smell a real live doe, he knows that's a dangerous source of pheromone. More like, even to add to the problem, it's almost sure that smell going downwind is going to contain odors from you. Now, we'll talk more about that later, and I've talked about it many times, but you can't get rid of all human odors when you're hunting whitetail. No matter what you use, they're going to smell you downwind. And you got to be careful about that. You know, there's deer that make mistakes, like younger bucks will make mistakes. But the big dominant breeding bucks, that's going to be pretty rare that they're going to make a mistake. Now, here's that buck downwind. Oh, there's pheromone there. But there's no odors made by a real live doe. But there are some odors made by a real live human. And after all these years of humans using this scent to attract bucks, he knows there's a human sitting in a tree over there where that smell is coming from, or is sitting on the ground, but he's over there, and this buck is going to say, no way am I going to go there. Imagine that. Your doe and estrus lure scent may be acting as a buck repellent because of that. Now, if that buck is downwind and he smells it, oh, real live smell of a doe, all these odors coming off the, and no odors of a human, he won't hesitate to go to that spot. So when you're using store-bought pheromone, you've got a handicap involved there. Now, like I said, you can still use this scent to some success, not as success that we had back in the 80s, man, gosh. You know, I was a pioneer in using that stuff. I was writing all kinds of articles for magazines, putting on seminars, encouraging people, use lure scent, sit in a tree. Here's the way you put doe and estrus lure scent out to take a big buck. And back in those days, you could do almost anything and take a big buck using this thing. It's not that way today, and it never will be again, unless somebody can capture all those normal doe odors and put it together with that lure scent. And if you use it in a way that your scents are not traveling downwind with that lure scent. So think about that, you know, that's one reason things aren't working out so well. But there's lots of other reasons, and we'll get to lots of other reasons. I mean, you're so easy for those big bucks to identify and stay away that it's just uncanny. I mean, it would take really good luck to get a really big buck under such circumstances. Okay, so the second easiest buck to scout for, or stand site, to scout for a stand site to hunt bucks, are big dominant breeding bucks. How about that? Now, think about this now. Now all these other bucks, including some of them which are trophy class, are off range. They're living. And where are they living? They're living in small places. They're little hideaways. Most of them are only about a half acre in size. It might be a little highland out in a bog, you know, this all spruce bog around it, or out in a elder swamp all full of water, or a cedar swamp full of water, or a spruce bog, you know, well, I mean, there's a spruce bog around this thing, or out, you know, like in farmland, great big cattail swamp, boy, there are plenty of lesser adult bucks, antlered bucks, some of which can be really big, like I was saying, living that whole 3 weeks in a cattail swamp, laying out there in a place where they're not laying in water. Here's a dry area. Lay down in there, instantly out of sight. And humans don't want to go out there in cattail swamps. Oh no, they aren't going to go out there. Safe place. Humans don't want to go out in flooded spruce bogs or elder swamps or ash sloughs. There's lots of places like that. But you're out in the woods. No, I'm not going out here. I'm not going to step in water over the tops of my boots. I'm going to stay away from there. So they don't go. They know all kinds of safe places all over the place. Some of them might be a mile away. In a farm area, it might be a farm that has all kinds of no trespassing signs around it. Now, deer don't read the no trespassing signs. They make some of their own. They probably understand how that would work, but they don't. I don't think they realize that no trespassing sign means this is a safe place. But they've learned no hunters go there. There's no shooting out there. There aren't people walking around talking. None of that. It's a safe place. So they know safe place. You know, a big dominant breeding buck, the biggest antlers in the woods. He's got safe places up his sleeve, probably several of them, depending on which way the wind's blowing, when he decides you better get out of here, because it's too dangerous here. When he decides to go somewhere else, that doesn't mean he quits breeding. He might breed at night then. You come back, take care of does and heat, and then go, before it gets light in the morning, go back to a safe place like that. And does, when they're in heat, they don't just stand around some ground scrape somewhere waiting for a buck to show up. They go looking for the buck, and it's easy. Let's say here's a doe, oh, she's in heat now, and that buck is up here with a doe in heat. And she's not gonna wait around, and she's gonna head right to where that buck is, because she can smell that stinking buck a mile away, easy. I'm gonna go up there so I can get bread. You know, they've all been through this. They know this is the program, this is the way you do it. So they're gonna go there. But let's think about this. Come the hunting season, especially if you hunt in early November and breeding is going on, where are all the bucks? Well, there might be one or two yearling bucks in this square mile now and then, and they're on the move quite a bit because the big buck keeps chasing them out of there. They're there, they show up. But what about all these that got chased off range? They stay away. They know it's not safe to be in here until breeding is over. And finally, they're out here, and so let's say the wind is blowing from that direction toward them, and no more pheromone here. And they might wait a day or two but to make sure, but there's no more pheromone here. It's safe to go back home. But during that period, those bucks are really hidden in these secluded little hideaways. There's not a lot of deer trails there. There may be only one. I remember one I used to get when things got rough, I went there to get a buck. It wasn't as big as the other bucks, but 3 of the biggest bucks I've ever gotten were taken at places off range in elder swamps, for example, or the spruce bog. And there's a trail, usually one trail, maybe 2, in that little half-acre highland out there in that bog. And this particular one, it was surrounded by a moat of water with grass in it, grass all around. And then the edges were all filled in with elder brush, and they're 10 inches tall and interlacing branches. And the trail would be inside here along one side. And I learned early, many years, maybe 50 years ago, if I get in there, if the wind is blowing in this direction, and I made a trail through the bog, and I even made a bridge across a creek. So to get there, a little bridge, to get there, and I could get there from downwind, I would sit in the thick spruces over on one side here and watch. You could see holes through the alders to that trail, because along that trail, those bucks commonly will make a lot of antler rubs and ground scrape. Yeah, every 10 feet here's another antler rub or ground scrape. And they'll keep renewing them all during the time does are in heat in here. And so they move quite a bit. They might decide, I'm gonna go renew a couple ground scrape midday. You never knew. I would get in there in the morning when it was still dark and keep an eye on some openings to the trail there. And I got quite a few, at this one spot, I would say over a period from about 1970 until 1989, I took about 4 nice bucks spending their time during breeding on a little island. You couldn't walk out there, go through this water, and to get to that spot, you had to stay away from them. And that's the thing. Now, some of the biggest bucks I've ever taken were lesser antlered bucks at these hideaways off range. And that includes my 2 biggest. My big 10-pointer I got in the Floodwood area many years ago, and the 12-pointer I got over here a number of years ago now. But those were lesser adult bucks, but big nonetheless. Trophy class bucks you'd put on the wall. But those are examples. These are examples of lesser antlered bucks. They weren't dominant breeding bucks. They were bucks hiding in these areas off range. The thing about this is, those are hard to find. You can walk within 100 feet of one of those hideaways, buck hideaways, without seeing it or realizing it's there. Now, last year, I spent my last 2 days of the hunting season exploring, scouting actually, for bucks like this in areas I haven't hunted for years or never hunted, to see if I could find more of these particular bucks living off range during this period. Now, I couldn't, my study area is big. I mean, basically it's 8 square miles. We do most of our hunting within 6 square miles, and then 2 square miles I don't visit very often because it's quite a distance to get there. And I'm getting old. But anyway, the southern half of the 4 square mile area, I started going through areas surrounding a buck home range, out to half a mile from the edge of that half mile, and sometimes a little bit more, looking for these hideaways of these older bucks that normally live on that range. And our deer numbers being low there, I didn't find a lot of them. But generally, there was not a square mile in that area where I didn't add 1 to 3 of these non-breeding bucks to the numbers that I thought we had in that area. I found places like that, and some of them really surprised me. The most difficult of bucks to hunt, especially while breeding is in progress, are these non-breeding mature bucks. Bucks that are 2.5 to 6.5 years of age. Those are tough deer to hunt because they don't want to be bothered by those bucks. And in our hunting, those big dominant breeding bucks, they're afraid of them. They're really well hidden in these little areas. They got food, water, cover, everything they need to live in those little spots for that period of time. And they're perfectly willing to stay there where they're safe during this period. Safe from hunters as well, and even wolves. So those are hard deer to find. And when you do find them, they aren't always easy to hunt as well. I'm going to tell you more, talk quite a bit about places where I found those. We'll talk, before we're done with this, we'll talk about places where I end up hunting older bucks, the big dominant breeding bucks as well, which are easier to find, easier to predict. But these guys, there's no predicting them. They're going to just stay out there and be invisible all through the hunting season because of where they are and what they're doing. Yearling bucks, you can get yearling bucks. Big dominant breeding bucks, if you understand habits and behavior of dominant breeding bucks during this period, and can understand meanings of the deer signs they make during that period. Now, this has got to be a long hunting seminar. So I'm going to quit here. And so we are going to talk about how to find these areas and how to identify them next time I talk to you. We're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about how to find and hunt these bucks. And never believe that when you do that, you're hunting lesser bucks. They can be every bit as big, some of them, as that big dominant breeding buck that owns this, but he's meaner. He's more aggressive. That might be the only difference. So finding bucks like that where they're living during this period are really worthwhile. Now, you can find places like that before breeding begins, before these bucks even show up at these places, because one of the signs they make when this is happening will be visible while scouting during the following October. So if you're having trouble finding big bucks, it'll be worth your while, really, to find these hideaways before hunting season begins. Yeah, spring's coming. My boys and I like spring scouting. Before all the ticks come out, leaves come out in the spring. Because one of the reasons being, those at that time, they are more easy, these hideaways are more easy to spot and realize what they are at that time. And once you find a, let's say you know 6 places where these bucks are living during that particular period. Boy, your odds of taking a nice buck that year are going to be very good. So they're worth looking for, but they are, honestly, they're tough to not find. Now guys, you've heard a lot of different things today, things you never thought of, I know. And we're not done, not by a long shot, but there's a lot to know to become regularly successful at hunting older bucks, and you're starting to realize why. Now, everything I've talked about so far, and will talk about in the future dealing with this particular subject, is in this book. Now, I'm 85, meaning I'm not going to be doing this research, and I'm not going to be hunting, and I may not even be in this world sometime in the near future. And from that time on, the only place you're going to find all of this information to check on, to review, to go over each hunting season, to get ready for buck hunting, is going to be in this book. Only place you're going to find it. So you don't want to be without this book after I'm gone. And so be sure you get your copy in the near future. Have this around. You're going to use this book for the rest of your life as a hunter. You'll use it because you know what you learn in here works. You will, if you don't know it yet, you will know it in the future. Boy, that stuff sure works. I get letters from hunters all the time who tell me it works. It really works. Well, the guy got this book a couple years ago, and he didn't pay much attention to it till this last year. And he'd been reading my books and magazine articles and things like that before that, but when he started reading this book, he started to realize how important it was. And because of that, he bought 7 books for his hunting buddies. Make sure that they all had one. And this is a guy that recognized how important this book is. So that might happen to you. But really, you're going to want this book. And someday you might say, boy, I wish I would have bought it when I had a chance. With that, before you hit the button to look at something else on your internet, be sure to hit that subscribe button. It doesn't cost you anything. It might take you a minute of your time, but I would appreciate it if you would do that. It means a lot to me in my future as a seminar speaker on YouTube. And also, the thumbs up button, that's important too. If you've enjoyed what you read here, or learned today, be sure to hit that as well. And I want to thank you for that. And with that, thanks for watching, and don't miss my next 2 or 3 hunting seminars. They're all dealing with this same subject. And now that you've had time to think about it a little bit, you're beginning to realize, I've got to learn this stuff. So don't miss it. We'll see you again soon. Be sure to visit my website. Here's the link. Here you'll find links to my blog posts, my Twitter account, my YouTube account, my Amazon store with links to my ebooks, my son's eBay store, a money saver if you're ordering from Canada or other countries, my website bookstore, and much more.